Should I refer back to the literature in my findings chapter, or should I simply just present my findings and then leave any references to the literature until I get on to the next chapter, the discussion chapter? Well, there is no right answer that applies across the board, but in this video, I'm going to tell you how to find out what you should be doing in your dissertation, and I'm going to be walking you through what you should be including in your findings chapter, regardless of whether or not you're referring back to the literature in it. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, and I've spent the last 20 years supporting postgrad and PhD students through their dissertations. Now, the findings chapter is a cheeky one. It can be really tricky, and often you don't realise how tricky it is until you actually arrive at it and you're like, okay, what do I do here? So that is why I have made a series of 4 videos all about the findings chapter. This is just the first one. There are 3 more in which I'm going to be looking at how to present particular types of data. So quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods. So make sure you come back for those. But back to this one, in which I want to tackle this confusion around literature and findings. So here's what we'll be looking at. Firstly, we're going to be looking at whether or not you should be referring back to the literature. Secondly, we're going to look at the 3 key elements of findings chapters, so describe, analyse and synthesise. And thirdly, we're going to finish with a summary of all of that stuff. So first up, should you refer back to the literature in your findings chapter? As I've just said, there is no right or wrong answer to this, and the answer is going to depend on the subject area that you're researching in. Disciplinary traditions matter here. So particular social science disciplines have specific ways of going about presenting the findings. So you need to be aware of what the standard practice is in your area. Some social science disciplines integrate the findings and the discussion elements of research. So they simultaneously present the findings whilst thinking through the implications for the literature. Other social science disciplines keep these things completely separate, so they will present the findings in isolation and then they will think through the implications for the wider literature in the discussion chapter. And also, it's not just subject or discipline traditions and practices that have an impact here. I've tended to find that types of research will have an impact on the findings chapter too. So I've come across a lot of qualitative researchers who prefer to integrate the findings and the literature. And I've also encountered a lot of quantitative researchers who have a preference for keeping those things completely separate. But that is just what I've come across in my life in academia. So there are no hard and fast rules around it. So the easiest way to find out whether you should be integrating the literature into your findings chapter or whether you should be keeping them completely separate is to talk to your supervisor. So make that the first thing that you do after you've finished watching this video. Go and ask them the question. Okay, so when you get your answer to that question, what do you do with your findings chapter from there? Now, here is where we need to look at the 3 things that happen in findings chapters. So let's take a look at that. So description, analysis and synthesis are your 3 key elements of findings chapters. Now, you may not need to include all 3. You might need to include just 2. And that is going to depend on whether or not you're referring back to the literature in your findings chapter. We're going to go into more detail and look at those elements individually in a moment. But before we get onto that, you need to understand which of them you should be focusing on in your findings chapter. So you need to figure out whether or not you should refer back to the literature. And once you've got your answer to that question, you can see which of these elements you need to include in yours. So I'm going to stop whittering on now and we're going to put this in a nice little table. Okay, so if you need to refer back to the literature, you will describe, analyse and synthesise in your findings chapter. That is because you're outlining what you found and you are critically considering that in light of the existing literature. If you need to keep your findings completely separate from the literature, if you are merely presenting your findings in isolation in your findings chapter, then you will need to focus on the describe and analyse parts of the process. The function of your findings chapter is simply to present the findings and offer some relevant commentary about them. In your discussion chapter, you'll move on to the synthesis stage where you revisit the literature and you critically consider your findings in light of it. So remember which of those you need to do. Do you need to be describing and analysing, or do you need to be describing, analysing and synthesising? Now let's take a look at what each of these elements involve. First up, describe. And this one is super simple. Present your data. You are simply and clearly stating what you found. Now let me insert some examples here so you can see what this looks like. And I'll be using these same examples for analyse and synthesise as well. So there's no need to take a screenshot just yet. You can take one of the full table in a moment. Secondly, analyse. So here you interpret what the data shows. You offer some comment with reference to your own data. Not the literature, your own data. I'm going to say that again because it is super important. So when you are analysing, you are offering comment with reference to your own data. Not the literature, to your own data. So using the same examples, what might that look like? Well, kind of like this. Lastly, synthesise. Here you are positioning the data. You are critically considering it in the context of the existing literature that you looked at in your literature review. So here you are referring back to the literature. Let's go to the examples again to see what this might look like. So can you see how we are essentially creating layers in our findings chapters? We're starting by stating the obvious, and then we're going into more detail, thinking about the so what question and linking back to the literature, if that is something we need to do. So feel free to take a screenshot of this if that's going to be helpful. I really want to emphasise the importance of the describe phase of your findings chapter, because it is really important to tell people what you found, to state the obvious at the beginning. A lot of the students I've worked with over the years, the postgrads, the PhD students, when they've been working on their findings chapter, there's been a tendency to want to just dive straight into the complexity. And sometimes this can actually be quite confusing for your examiner because you're going straight for the complex and the intricate and the detailed, and they're like, hang on a minute, what's the context of this? What is this in light of? What have they found? Like, what's going on? So make sure you don't skip the describe phase because it's a really important one. The describe phase is so important because it forces you to actually describe what you found. And I know that that sounds odd because of course you know what you found, you collected this data, you analysed this data, but the difference now is that you are having to explain that to someone else, i.e. your examiner. So you need to break it down for them. And if you do that clearly, if you do that strategically, in the way that I've described to you, then your examiner is not going to be sat there scratching their head wondering what on earth this is all about because you haven't taken the time to actually set the context. You don't want a confused examiner because a confused examiner is not a happy examiner. So to summarise, firstly, you need to talk to your supervisor to understand what exactly it is you should be doing in your findings chapter. Should you be referring back to the literature or not? Secondly, when you are clear on whether or not you should be referring back to the literature, you need to understand which of those three elements of the findings chapter you should be focusing on. Should you be describing and analysing, or should you be describing, analysing and synthesising? If you are referring back to the literature, then you will need to describe, analyse and synthesise in your findings chapter. If you are not referring back to the literature, you will just need to describe and analyse in the findings chapter, and then when it comes to your discussion chapter, that is when you start to synthesise. Let's have a quick recap of what each of those elements are. When you are describing, you are presenting your data. You are clearly and simply stating what you found. When you analyse, you are interpreting what the data shows, and you are offering comment with reference to your own data. When you're synthesising, you are situating your data. You are critically considering it in the context of the existing literature. I hope this video has cleared a few things up for you when it comes to the findings chapter, and make sure that you join me for the next video in which I'm going to be looking at some of the key problems that students experience when they are presenting qualitative findings. So I hope to see you there.